I thought I was bringing home an old dog that nobody wanted. He was 12 years old, half-blind, limped when he walked, and spent every day lying quietly in the back corner of the animal shelter while younger dogs were adopted one after another. The volunteer told me he had been returned twice after his owner passed away because he was too old. My heart broke, so I took him home that afternoon. Later that night, while gently removing his cracked leather collar to give him a bath, I noticed a tiny metal capsule hidden inside the stitching. Curious, I unscrewed it and found a small brass key wrapped around a faded note. It contained just one sentence. If you're reading this, they never found it. I had no idea what it meant, but within a week, strangers were following me. An attorney showed up at my front door asking questions about the dog, and I uncovered a secret worth more than $1 million that someone was willing to do anything to keep buried. A lonely old dog to save his life. I never imagined he would completely change mine. My name is Emma Parker. I'm 39 years old, and I thought I was bringing home an old dog that nobody wanted. He was 12 years old, half-blind, limped when he walked, and spent every day lying quietly in the back corner of the animal shelter while younger dogs were adopted one after another. The volunteer told me he had been returned twice after his owner passed away because he was too old. My heart broke, so I took him home that afternoon. Later that night, while gently removing his cracked leather collar to give him a bath, I noticed a tiny metal capsule hidden inside the stitching. Curious, I unscrewed it and found a small brass key wrapped around a faded note. It contained just one sentence. If you're reading this, they never found it. I had no idea what it meant, but within a week, strangers were following me. An attorney showed up at my front door asking questions about the dog, and I uncovered a secret worth more than $1 million that someone was willing to do anything to keep buried. A lonely old dog to save his life. I never imagined he would completely change mine. The volunteer unlocked the kennel door, and Rusty walked toward me with slow, careful steps. His right front leg had a slight limp, and I could tell his joints were stiff from age, but the moment he reached me, he gently rested his head against my knee. I scratched behind his ears, and his tail began wagging a little faster. "He's the sweetest dog we've ever had," the volunteer said. "He hardly barks. He loves people. He just misses his owner." I asked what had happened. She explained that Rusty's owner, a retired engineer named Walter Hayes, had died unexpectedly from a heart attack. Since he had no immediate family nearby, Rusty had been brought to the shelter. 2 different families had adopted him, but both returned him within weeks, saying he was too quiet, too old, and required more care than they expected. Hearing that broke my heart. Rusty wasn't difficult. He was grieving, just like I was. I looked into his gentle brown eyes and saw something familiar, a sadness that doesn't disappear overnight but quietly settles into your heart after losing someone you love. Without thinking any longer, I smiled at the volunteer and said, "I'd like to take him home." Her face lit up with relief. "Really?" I nodded. "Yes. I think we both need a fresh start." While she prepared the adoption paperwork, she handed me a small envelope that had been kept with Rusty's file. "These belong to Mr. Hayes," she explained. Inside were Rusty's vaccination records, a faded photograph of Walter sitting on a wooden dock with Rusty beside him, and a handwritten note that simply read, "Take good care of my best friend." I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my purse, promising myself I'd do exactly that. An hour later, Rusty climbed into the passenger seat of my car without hesitation. As we drove toward my little cottage by the lake, he rested his head against the window, quietly watching the trees pass by. Every now and then, he glanced at me as if making sure I was still there. I smiled and reached over to gently pat his shoulder. "Don't worry, buddy," I whispered. "You're home now." I had no way of knowing that bringing Rusty into my life wasn't just the beginning of a friendship. It was the first step toward uncovering a secret his late owner had protected for years, a secret hidden in the old leather collar still fastened around Rusty's neck. Rusty settled into my cottage much faster than I expected. He slowly explored every room, sniffed each corner, then chose a sunny spot beside the living room window where he could watch the lake. That first evening, I cooked myself dinner while he lay quietly nearby, lifting his head every time I spoke to him. It had been months since I'd had another living soul in the house, and somehow the silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. Before bedtime, I decided to give him a warm bath. His fur was clean but carried the scent of the shelter, and I wanted him to feel comfortable in his new home. As I filled the tub with warm water, I gently unclipped the old leather collar from around his neck. It was cracked with age, the brass buckle was badly scratched, and the leather looked as though it had been worn every single day for years. Just as I was about to set it on the bathroom counter, something caught my attention. One section of the collar felt unusually thick. Curious, I pressed my fingers along the inside seam and noticed a tiny raised bump hidden beneath the worn leather stitching. It didn't feel like part of the collar at all. I carried it under the bright bathroom light and looked more closely. Carefully running my fingernail along the edge, I found a nearly invisible flap that had been stitched so neatly it blended into the leather. My heartbeat quickened. Using a small pair of sewing scissors, I gently loosened a few loose threads without damaging the collar. A tiny silver metal capsule slid into my hand. Rusty, now standing beside me with his tail slowly wagging, watched quietly as if he had seen it before. The capsule was no bigger than my little finger and had a screw-top lid. I hesitated for a moment before twisting it open. Inside was a tiny brass key wrapped in a tightly folded piece of yellowed paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky but neat. It contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, they never found it. I read the words 3 more times, hoping they would suddenly make sense. They didn't. I looked down at Rusty. He simply tilted his head and blinked at me, completely unaware that the old collar he'd worn for years had just changed everything. I slipped the key and note back into the capsule, placed it carefully on the counter, and looked at the faded photograph of Walter Hayes that had come home with us from the shelter. For the first time, I wondered if the quiet old man smiling beside Rusty had left behind far more than memories. And deep inside, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone, somewhere, was still searching for whatever they had never found. I barely slept that night. The tiny brass key sat on my bedside table beside the folded note, and every time I closed my eyes, I found myself wondering what it opened. A safety deposit box? A locker? An old chest? Or was it something far less valuable that an elderly man simply wanted to keep hidden? By morning, I had convinced myself I was overthinking it. Walter Hayes had probably hidden the key inside Rusty's collar because he trusted his dog more than anyone else. It didn't necessarily mean there was a fortune waiting to be found. Still, I couldn't ignore the curiosity growing inside me. After feeding Rusty breakfast, I took out the photograph the shelter had given me and studied it more carefully. Walter was sitting on a weathered wooden dock with Rusty at his side. In the background, I noticed a small red cabin surrounded by tall pine trees. On the back of the photo, written in faded blue ink, were the words, Black Pine Lake,
Summer 2018.
I had never heard of Black Pine Lake, so I opened my laptop and searched for it. To my surprise, it was less than 30 minutes from Maple Ridge. The lake was small, surrounded by national forest with only a handful of cabins scattered along the shoreline. One property record caught my attention. A cabin on the eastern shore was still listed under the name Walter Hayes, even though county tax records showed it had been vacant since his death. My curiosity turned into determination. I decided to drive there that afternoon. Rusty seemed unusually excited when I picked up my car keys. His tail wagged constantly as if he somehow knew where we were going. The drive wound through narrow mountain roads lined with towering pines until we finally reached a rusted wooden sign that read Black Pine Lake. The place was quiet, almost forgotten by time. Following the address from the property records, I eventually found the cabin from the photograph. It was exactly as I remembered it, small, red, and weathered by years of harsh winters. The front porch sagged slightly, weeds had grown across the stone walkway, and the mailbox leaned at an angle overflowing with old flyers. As soon as I parked, Rusty let out a soft whine. Before I could stop him, he climbed out of the car and slowly walked toward the porch. His limp seemed to disappear for a moment as he sniffed the wooden steps, wagging his tail gently. He wasn't exploring a strange place. He was coming home. I followed him quietly, my heart heavy as I imagined the life Walter and Rusty must have shared there. Just as I reached the front door, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt driveway. They couldn't have been more than a day or two old. Someone had been here recently. Before I had time to think about it, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching from the road behind me. A black pickup truck rolled to a stop a few yards away. An older man stepped out, removed his sunglasses, and looked directly at me. "You're not supposed to be here," he said calmly. Then his eyes moved to Rusty, and his expression changed completely. "Wait," he whispered. "Is that Walter's dog?" I instinctively stepped closer to Rusty. The old dog stood beside me, watching the stranger without barking. The man looked to be in his late 60s, wearing faded jeans, worn work boots, and a flannel shirt. His weathered face suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors. He slowly approached, then stopped a few feet away, giving Rusty time to recognize him. Rusty's ears perked up. A second later, his tail began wagging. He limped forward, sniffed the man's hand, and gently licked his fingers. The man's eyes filled with tears. "Well, Albie," he whispered. "You remember me, don't you, old boy?" He knelt down and hugged Rusty carefully. "I haven't seen you since Walter passed," I finally spoke. "You knew Walter?" He stood and nodded. "Name's Frank Dawson. I own the cabin across the lake for almost 20 years. Walter and I fish together nearly every weekend." I relaxed slightly but stayed cautious. "I adopted Rusty from the shelter yesterday." Frank smiled sadly. "Walter would have been happy. He worried about that dog more than he worried about himself." I glanced toward the cabin. Do you know why someone would have hidden a key inside Rusty's collar? The smile disappeared from Frank's face. He looked at me for several long seconds before asking quietly, "You found it?" My heart skipped. "So you knew about it." Frank looked around as if making sure no one else was nearby. "Not here," he said in a low voice. "Let's sit on the porch." We climbed the old wooden steps, and Frank lowered himself into a rocking chair that creaked with age. Rusty lay down at his feet as though he'd done it 100 times before. Frank took a deep breath. About 6 months before Walter died, he told me he had hidden something important. He wouldn't tell me what it was. All he said was, "If anything happens to me, the only one I trust is Rusty." I reached into my purse, removed the small brass key, and showed it to him. Frank's eyes widened. "That's it," he whispered. "I've never actually seen it before, but Walter described it exactly. Do you know what it opens?" He slowly shook his head. "No, but I know where he wanted it to end up." My pulse quickened. "Where?" Frank pointed toward the old dock stretching into the lake. "Walter always said the answer wasn't inside the cabin." I frowned. "Then where?" Frank looked across the water toward a small wooded island near the center of the lake. "He used to row out there every Sunday morning with Rusty, never took anyone else, said it was the only place in the world where nobody could interrupt his thinking." I followed his gaze. The island was small, covered with tall pine trees, with what looked like the remains of an old stone chimney rising above the brush. "What's on that island?" I asked. Frank hesitated before answering. "An abandoned ranger cabin that burned down more than 40 years ago." He looked back at the tiny brass key in my hand. "If Walter left a secret behind?" He paused. "I'd start there." Just then, Rusty suddenly stood up, his ears alert. He stared toward the tree line behind the cabin and let out a low growl. The first sound of warning I'd heard from him since adopting him. Frank's expression changed instantly. He slowly turned his head toward the woods. "We're not alone," he whispered. Frank's voice had barely faded when I heard it too, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping somewhere behind the cabin. Rusty's growl grew louder, and the fur along his back stood up. He wasn't barking wildly, he was warning us. Frank slowly stood from the rocking chair and motioned for me to stay behind him. We stared toward the trees, but whoever had been there remained hidden. After nearly a minute, the woods fell silent again. "Probably someone watching the property," Frank said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or someone hoping we'd leave." My stomach tightened. "You think someone else knows about the key?" Frank looked at me. "I don't know what they know, but I do know Walter wasn't paranoid. If he hid something inside Rusty's collar, he had a good reason." We decided to go inside the cabin before driving to the island. Frank unlocked the front door with an old spare key he still carried. The hinges groaned as the door opened, releasing the smell of old wood and dust. Everything inside looked frozen in time. A plaid blanket still rested over the couch. Fishing rods leaned against the fireplace. An old coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter as if Walter had only stepped outside for a moment. Rusty walked slowly through each room, sniffing familiar corners before stopping beside an old wooden desk in the study. He sat down and looked up at me expectantly. "What's this?" I asked. Frank smiled faintly. "Walter spent hours at that desk." I opened the top drawer. Most of it contained ordinary things, pens, notebooks, old receipts, but tucked beneath a stack of envelopes was a leather-bound journal. On the inside cover, Walter had written, "If you're reading this, you've earned my trust by taking care of Rusty." My heart skipped. I carefully turned the first page. The journal wasn't about money or valuables. It was a record of Walter's life, his years as an engineer, his wife's battle with cancer, and the loneliness he felt after losing her. Page after page described Rusty as more than a pet. "He's the reason I get out of bed every morning," Walter had written. "Dogs don't care how much money you have. They only care whether you come home." I smiled through tears. Near the end of the journal, however, the tone changed. Walter wrote about discovering financial fraud at the engineering company where he had worked before retiring. According to his notes, several executives had hidden company assets by purchasing land and investments under fake corporations. Before retiring, Walter had quietly copied documents proving where the missing assets had been moved. He intended to report everything, but before he could, 2 of the executives died unexpectedly, and the company declared bankruptcy. Everyone assumed the missing assets were gone forever. Walter believed they were wrong. Tucked inside the last page was another folded note. It read, "The key opens the first lock, not the last. Trust Rusty. He always knows the way home." Before I could say anything, Rusty suddenly jumped to his feet and trotted toward the back door. He scratched at it twice, then looked back at me. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Looks like your partner wants us to follow him." I opened the door and Rusty limped quickly toward the old dock without looking back. As he reached the end of the weathered boards, he stopped, staring across the lake toward the tiny wooded island. The afternoon sun reflected off the calm water, making it almost impossible to see what lay beyond the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Walter had hidden all those years ago was waiting for us on that island, and that someone else was determined to find it first. Frank untied an old aluminum rowboat from the dock, checked the small outboard motor, and nodded. "She isn't pretty," he said with a faint smile, "but she'll get us across." Rusty climbed into the boat before either of us, settling near the bow as if he had made the trip hundreds of times. The ride to the island took less than 10 minutes, yet it felt much longer. The lake was perfectly still, and the only sounds were the hum of the motor and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. As we drew closer, I could make out the crumbling stone chimney Frank had pointed to earlier. The rest of the ranger cabin had long since burned away, leaving only scattered foundation stones hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves. The moment the boat touched shore, Rusty jumped onto the rocky bank and started walking with surprising confidence. He didn't wander or sniff aimlessly. He followed a narrow path through the pine trees as though he already knew exactly where he was going. Frank and I hurried after him until we reached the ruins of the old cabin. Rusty stopped beside the chimney, sniffed the ground carefully, then circled an enormous oak tree growing just a few feet away. Suddenly, he began pawing at the earth. "I think he's trying to show us something," I said. Frank knelt beside him and brushed away the leaves. Hidden beneath them was a flat iron hatch almost completely covered by years of dirt and roots. My heart raced. "This wasn't here when the cabin burned," Frank whispered. There was a small brass lock on the hatch. With trembling hands, I pulled Walter's tiny key from my pocket. It fit perfectly. I turned it slowly. Click. The lock released. Together, Frank and I lifted the heavy hatch. A narrow stone staircase disappeared into darkness below. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the smell of damp earth and old wood. Frank switched on a flashlight from his backpack. "Looks like some kind of storage cellar." We carefully climbed down the steps. At the bottom was a small underground room, untouched for decades. Wooden shelves lined the walls, but most had rotted away. In the center sat a single steel lockbox covered in dust. My pulse quickened. "This has to be it." I wiped away the dirt and noticed another keyhole. I frowned. The note said the key opened the first lock, not the last. Frank slowly nodded. "So there's another key." As I searched the room, Rusty walked over to the lockbox and sat quietly beside it. Hanging from the handle was a weathered leather pouch. Inside was another handwritten letter from Walter. "If you've made it this far, then you were kind enough to give an old dog the home he deserved. That tells me more about your character than anything else ever could." Tears filled my eyes as I continued reading. "The documents inside this box can change lives. But before you open it, remember this. Money reveals who people truly are. Use it to help others, not yourself alone. If you do that, then everything I protected was worth it." At the bottom of the letter was one final clue. The second key is where Rusty always waited for me. I looked around the underground room. There was no second key. Only the steel lockbox. And Walter's letter. Then Frank smiled. "I know exactly where that is." Before he could explain, we heard footsteps above us. Not one person. Several. They stopped directly over the open hatch. A deep voice echoed down into the cellar. "I knew someone would eventually find Walter's hiding place." The flashlight in Frank's hand trembled, because we both recognized the voice. It wasn't a stranger. It belonged to the lawyer who had visited my house 2 days earlier asking questions about Rusty. Here's the next section of the story. Frank immediately switched off the flashlight, plunging the cellar into darkness. We stood perfectly still, barely breathing. Rusty didn't bark. He simply moved closer to me, pressing against my leg as if he knew staying quiet was the safest thing to do. Above us, the lawyer laughed softly. "I know you're down there," he called. "You might as well come out." I recognized the voice instantly. His name was Richard Collins, the attorney who had knocked on my door claiming he was handling Walter Hayes' remaining affairs. At the time, he'd only asked whether I had adopted Rusty and whether the dog had been wearing his original collar. I thought the questions were strange. Now I understood why. Frank leaned close and whispered, "Don't answer him." A second voice came from above. "The hatch is open." Then another. "Should we go down?" Richard replied calmly, "No, they'll have to come back up eventually." My heart pounded. We were trapped. I looked around the cellar with my phone's flashlight on its dimmest setting. There had to be another way out, but all I saw were stone walls, broken shelves, and the locked steel box. Then Rusty did something unexpected. He walked to the far corner of the room and began scratching at the dirt floor. Frank frowned. "What's he doing?" I knelt beside Rusty and brushed away the loose soil with my hands. Beneath it was an old wooden trapdoor almost completely hidden under decades of dust. Frank's eyes widened. "I've been coming to this island for 20 years, and I never knew this was here." Together we pulled the trapdoor open. A narrow tunnel stretched into darkness. Fresh air drifted through it. "It's another exit," Frank whispered. We didn't hesitate. I picked up Walter's letter, slipped the tiny brass key back into my pocket, and followed Rusty into the tunnel. We crawled for what felt like forever before faint daylight appeared ahead. A few moments later, we emerged behind a cluster of enormous boulders on the opposite side of the island. From there, we could see Richard Collins and two other men standing near the open hatch. One of them looked down into the cellar and shouted, "They're gone!" Richard's face hardened. They found the escape tunnel. He kicked the ground in frustration. "Spread out, search the island." Frank pulled me behind the rocks. "They can't see us from here." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "But they still think we have whatever Walter hid." Frank looked at me. "We don't." I glanced at the brass key in my hand. "We only have the first key." His expression suddenly changed. "The second key? You said you knew where it was." He smiled for the first time in hours. "Walter used to fish from the end of his dock every single evening. So?" Frank looked down at Rusty, who was wagging his tail despite everything that was happening. "He never waited inside the cabin. He always waited on one particular bench at the end of the dock." I remembered Walter's note. "The second key is where Rusty always waited for me." It wasn't talking about the island. It was talking about the old wooden bench beside the lake, the place where Rusty had spent countless evenings waiting for his best friend to finish fishing. Richard was searching the wrong location, and unless he realized Walter's clue had a second meaning, we still had a chance to reach the second key before he did. Frank and I waited until Richard Collins and his men disappeared deeper into the island before quietly rowing back across the lake. Every second felt like an hour. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting another boat to appear behind us, but the water remained calm. The moment we reached Walter's cabin, Rusty jumped onto the dock and, despite his age, hurried straight to the old wooden bench at the very end. He stopped, looked at me, and gently tapped one of the weathered boards with his paw. My heart raced. Frank and I knelt beside the bench and turned it over. At first, we saw nothing but rusted bolts and faded wood. Then Frank noticed one bolt that looked newer than the others. He removed it with his pocket knife, and a narrow wooden compartment slid open. Inside lay a second brass key, a sealed envelope, and a small flash drive wrapped in waterproof plastic. I carefully opened the envelope. It was Walter's final letter. "If you found this, then Rusty has chosen the right person. The key opens the lockbox beneath the island. The flash drive contains every financial record, property deed, investment account, and signed statement proving that the missing assets belong to the Hayes Animal Rescue Foundation I established before my death. My attorney, Richard Collins, was supposed to create the foundation after I was gone. Instead, I discovered he planned to forge new documents and claim everything for himself. That's why I fired him and hid the evidence where only Rusty could protect it. If Richard finds these records first, the fortune will disappear forever. Please take this evidence to attorney Linda Brooks in Maple Ridge. She is the only person I trust to carry out my final wishes." I stared at the letter, stunned. The mystery had never been about buried treasure. Walter hadn't hidden money, he had hidden the proof of who it truly belonged to. Just then, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed through the trees. Frank looked toward the driveway and his face turned pale. Richard Collins' black SUV had pulled up beside the cabin, followed by another vehicle. Richard stepped out, smiling as though he had already won. "Thank you," he called confidently. "You saved me hours of searching." He looked directly at the envelope in my hands. "Now hand me Walter's evidence and no one gets hurt." I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, tightened my grip on Rusty's collar, and stood between Richard and the dock. For the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid. Walter had trusted an old dog to protect the truth. Now it was my turn to finish what he had started. Here's the final section that concludes the story with a satisfying ending. Richard Collins took another step toward me, his smile fading when he realized I wasn't going to hand over the envelope. "You have no idea what you're involved in," he said. Before I could answer, the sound of police sirens echoed through the trees. Richard's expression changed instantly. Frank smiled. "I called the sheriff while we were crossing the lake," he said calmly. "Figured we'd need witnesses." Within moments, several sheriff's deputies pulled into the driveway, followed by attorney Linda Brooks, carrying a folder of legal documents. Richard tried to explain himself, claiming Walter had intended to leave everything to him, but the moment I handed Linda the flash drive, Walter's handwritten letter, and the second key, his story fell apart. The flash drive contained scanned bank records, property deeds, trust documents, and video recordings Walter had made shortly before his death. In one of the videos, Walter looked directly into the camera and said, "If Richard Collins is claiming my estate, he's lying. I dismissed him after discovering he intended to steal the foundation I created. Everything I own is to be used for abandoned and senior animals. If you're watching this, then Rusty found the right person." Richard's shoulders slumped as deputies placed him in handcuffs. Months later, after the investigation was complete, the court officially recognized Walter's final wishes. The investments he had protected for years had grown to more than $1.8 million. Every dollar was transferred into the Walter Hayes Animal Rescue Foundation, exactly as he had planned. Linda Brooks asked if I would serve as the foundation's first director. I accepted without hesitation. We purchased land outside Maple Ridge and built a modern rescue center dedicated to senior and abandoned animals, the very pets most people overlooked. The first building was named Rusty's House. No adoption fee was ever charged for senior dogs, because I never wanted money to stand between an old dog and a loving home. Rusty spent the rest of his life exactly as Walter had hoped, surrounded by kindness, sleeping in a warm bed every night, greeting every visitor with a slow wag of his tail. 2 years later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep, with his head resting on my lap. We buried him beneath a large oak tree overlooking the lake, beside a simple stone that reads, "Rusty, a faithful friend who never stopped leading people home." Sometimes I sit on the porch of my cottage and think about the day I walked into that shelter. I believed I was rescuing a lonely old dog that nobody wanted. The truth is, Rusty rescued me. He gave me purpose when I had lost my way, introduced me to people who became family, and led me to a secret that changed countless lives. Walter's fortune wasn't the greatest treasure he left behind. His greatest gift was reminding me that kindness always finds its way back to the people who give it freely. Sometimes, all it takes to change your life forever is saying yes to someone everyone else has forgotten. And that's my story. If this journey touched your heart, reminded you of the power of kindness, or kept you guessing until the very end, I'd truly appreciate your support. Please like this video, leave a comment to let me know what you would have done in my place, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories filled with mystery, unforgettable twists, and inspiring life lessons. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.